So welcome everybody to this week's Thursday talk. Your usual host, Sam, is in fact one of the interlocutors this afternoon, which is very exciting. So I have been drafted in, and I shall try and do my best Hardingham impression over the next few minutes. So just some notices of upcoming Thursday talks. Next week we have James and Tom Tatum from Noisescape talking on the concept of any media and its user. And just a reminder that last week we had Rochelle Spiteri from David Chipperfield Architects talking about living spaces, landscape ecology and residential typology in Australia, which is available on the YouTube channel along with many other Thursday and formerly Tuesday talks. This week, we're delighted to facilitate an international Thursday talk. Our academic director, Sam, the world's leading expert on the works of Cedric Price. Sam, have you got the books behind you to demonstrate, to quantify your expertise?
Otherwise, I don't.
You don't?
I don't, because I took them to a practice the other day and left them there.
Oh, right. Well, if you haven't seen them before, the two huge volumes on Cedric Price, they are proof of Sam's expertise if proof were needed. And she is joined by Jan Nauta, founder of Rotterdam-based Studio Nauta. Jan and Samantha both share an avid interest in the work of Cedric Price, having previously collaborated on 2 exhibitions and an oral history website. With Price's 40-year career exploring the dynamics of time in architecture, Price's work highlights the critical role that the brief plays in determining both the architectural output and its impact. Founded in 2013, Studio Nauta builds on this research, pursuing architecture as a craft with making deeply woven into the process. And of course, that's very much what we are seeking to promote through the LSA. So we're very much looking forward to hearing an example of how you can sustain this kind of practice. Through 2 of their recent housing projects, Studio Nauta will dissect their integral approach to addressing the competing ecological, social, and economic challenges of our time. So I'm going to hand over to Sam. I will disappear and then reappear at the end to convene a short discussion. So do please start banking your questions and putting them in the chat, and we'll come to you a little bit later on. So over to you, Sam. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Yes, you can hear me. Thank you, Neil. Really appreciate the introduction, and I am really delighted to be on the other side of the table today, and really pleased to invite Jan to the Thursday Talk series. I'm just going to talk for 5 minutes just to sort of set the scene and the context for why I have invited Jan, the work we've done together. The book that Neil mentioned a minute ago, no, I haven't got the object on the shelf, but here it is. This is really the project that I was working on when I met Jan, and Jan was a student at the Architectural Association. I was teaching at the time and researching for the book. I just need to now know how to, yes, there we go. And in the process of that research, the entire archive of Cedric's work was in Montreal at the Canadian Centre for Architecture. And so it was, I was making annual trips and collecting documentation and thinking all the time how to kind of start to assemble that into some form of publication. I didn't know at that time what the outcome was really going to be. And the way to kind of keep testing the thinking and testing some of the material that I was pulling together was to make small exhibitions, because it was incredibly good feedback loop to get a sense of, one, how much people, and particularly students at the time, knew about Cedric, knew about the work, knew about the ideas. You can see from this slide, it was 2011 that I did the first exhibition, which seems a shockingly long time ago now. And in fact, the book wasn't published until 5 years later. So this was quite early on in the research process. But what you can see here is a room at the Architectural Association with some drawings on the wall, which were actually very little drawings, which I blew up to big posters to start to these were all Cedric's ideas drawings. And then some pieces of furniture, which were made. There weren't any examples made in the world, so we used the drawing and created those, and made some films, made some interactive pieces of work around the archive. And then a particularly fantastic project that Jan came to me. He did 2 pieces of work and said, look, I'm really interested in the work. I would really like to make some films and document the people who knew Cedric, talk to them, find out what it was like to either work with him, be his client, be taught by him. So what you can see here is a little array of talking heads. And that was a project called Memory Bank that Jan put together with an amazing filmmaker from the Netherlands also, and told stories about Cedric's world. Cedric was no longer alive at this point. He had died in 2003. So it was an element of the work that that went into this sort of accumulation of research and documentation that went towards the book. This was another version of that memory bank. All these little monitors, you can see this is in the sort of dining room area of the Architectural Association. So people were sitting in the cafe and watching and listening to some of these films. So I was indebted to Jan for pulling that piece of work together, because it revealed a lot of interesting fact about the projects. We then went on to together, again, courtesy of Jan, because this time we were in Maastricht, to work on an exhibition at Bureau Europa in 2014. So now we're getting closer to the publication of the book. Material is coming together. My ideas were getting clearer. Jan was also now pretty well out in the world as an architect. Yes, correct? Just about.
Most, yeah.
Yes, dipping his toe, thinking about it. And so but this was sort of, again, a way of, we'd sort of moved on 3 years. We had more clarity around the kinds of projects that were, seemed to be coming to the fore. There was a lot of interest in this particular area of the Netherlands around the industrial areas, and a kind of rethinking of what the use of those spaces would be, or places. What you can see on the far wall is an array of photographs by a photographer called Bas Prinsen, who documented the project of Cedric's called Potteries Think Belt. I'm going to flick onto that. And a Potteries Think Belt, I guess, is really the project that that I would say is the kind of resonant project for us, and why I sort of make this connection with Jan's work. The photographs that Bas took were of the potteries area, which is an area of the Midlands around Stoke, and what were formerly the potteries production area. But today, or when then it was 2014, and those pictures are really of undergrowth, of wild green wilderness, and that wild green wilderness previously looked like this grey picture on the right-hand side of this slide, which was the potteries in 1964, when Cedric went up to look at the site. All of the ceramics production was in decline. These were mining fields. It was a grey, heavily industrialized land, toxic soil, unstable soil. All of the area, that area of Staffordshire, and I can show it to you more precisely on this map. This was the area of the project. This is essentially the plan of Cedric's Potteries Think Belt project. The Potteries Think Belt was a proposal for a university, a new kind of university that made use of derelict transport systems that were previously used for the potteries industry, that connected these towns, Burslem and Stoke and Kiel, etc. And those areas, Cedric proposed that those would be reconnected. He would reuse existing infrastructures, existing skill base. The population of that area had decades, if not more, of experience working with both heavy and light industries, but full spectrum. And as I said, the industry itself was in decline. So what to do with one, a kind of social experience, as well as a political one and an economic one in decline, and how to reinvigorate that. So we talk a lot about rethinking, repurposing, reinvigorating. And for Cedric, very much about the coordination, and this is where it was really a project about the coordination and the logistics of bringing those moments together, where trains became places to learn, classrooms, literally mobile classrooms, moving from one place to another. And then really importantly, housing. Housing was a big byproduct of the project. And you can see from the key on this plan that there were areas for faculty, but there were different types of housing that kind of responded to this very time-based and mobile facility. So that, I hope, sets a little bit of the scene, and I'm sure we can come back to it. But I really want to hand over to Jan, because I think what's important is this, just to remind everybody, this is 1964. We are now in nearly 2024. And that's an awful long time for thinking about, in architectural terms, thinking about the complexities of, one, working with very dynamic systems, two, really thinking about the reinvigoration of land and whole areas of countries that are undergoing massive change. And we are absolutely in that moment now. And I know that Jan is working on a project which I'm just about to learn a lot more about, but I hope some of this resonates. So I'm going to hand over to you, Jan, now, and hear about what you're doing.
Well, it's difficult to pick up from here. It's always fascinating to hear from you about Cedric. Let me see if I can share the screen. You should be able to see my screen now. I'm going to get nowhere near the sort of level of experimentation and inventiveness that you just described. I'm going to give you a small insight into a much more mundane form of practice, but it's always about time. It's often about Cedric, who is, to me, a kind of parrot on the shoulder, who, as a kind of has a conscience kind of role. And it's often also about housing. I thought I'd briefly say something about who we are as a practice and how we work. And then I was going to show you two projects. I decided to make it one, so we can go a little bit more in depth. And I also thought it would be good to show the process of acquiring such a project. I was thinking that this is something that I missed in school. You know, it took me years after graduating to figure out how you get your hands on interesting work. So I'm going to talk about that as well a little bit. So who we are and how we work. Well, Sam already gave this introduction. I graduated in London in 2011. And at the time, I really did not want to become a practicing architect. I was much more interested in making events, working on publications, exhibitions, a lot around Cedric, but also other things. And I was fortunate enough to work with Samantha and work in fantastic institutions like Bureau Europa, like the Venice Biennale and Woodbury University in America. But after a while, I received an opportunity to do some physical work, like building work, and actually that was surprisingly good to me. So I decided to fully go for a career as a practicing architect. This is next door to where I'm sitting now. This is in the middle of our studio here in Rotterdam. We have a space on the waterfront with a fantastic view, and we work here with a team of 10 relatively young, very talented and ambitious individuals. And the studio was, in the earlier years, we did a lot of kind of private projects, as you do as a starting architects for one-off houses. And I think what we learned is that projects for us are always specific. They're always related to a place, related to a client, relating to budgets, relating to specific rules that apply to the site. So I think if you look at our work, it's difficult to kind of identify one visual kind of consistency. But all these projects, they incorporate lessons. In recent years, we're working on a much broader range of projects. So we're doing master plans, so like big frameworks for housing. We're working on a library in Antwerp. There's a fire station also in Antwerp, so that's in Belgium. So the work tends to focus on community buildings, on larger housing projects where we are very interested in the sort of industrial transformation that the construction industry is currently undergoing with new raw materials. And we will always continue to do small projects like this little swimming pool and a pool house. Those projects allow us to experiment with, in this case, materials such as rammed earth. We always work together, often with other architects, but always closely with clients and with builders. So that idea of really immersing with the world that the project sits in is important for us. Also to create the kind of influence that we think we need to get the things that we think are important done. So that's just a brief introduction of who we are as a practice. And from now on, I'll be talking about one single project, which is the garden housing city. Let me just see if I can make zoom smaller so I can see slides. There we go. So this project is started for us as a competition organized by the chief government architect that we have in the Netherlands. So that's a kind of national program for spatial quality, and they since a few years are working on this program for bio-based and nature-inclusive building. So that's a program that tries to stimulate innovation in the architectural and construction industry, and they do so by organizing competitions throughout the country. That starts like this: it's an open call with a fairly compact brief where they outline the ambitions for the site, the ambitions for bio-based and nature-inclusive building, and what that is will become clearer as I show the project. But it's this fairly general invitation to participate. So it starts with a pre-selection, and there were 60 submissions. And this is ours. We were allowed to submit 3 A3s. And what you see here is a proposal for a team. So we decided to sign up with a broad team. And the requirement was that you would be architects, but we included a landscape architect, a material specialist, a timber engineer, a timber construction company, a sustainability engineering advisory consultancy kind of club, a developer, a social entrepreneur specializing in community land trusts, and wrote a little motivation, showed some work of our office and the Mulder Zonderland, which is a practice from Switzerland that we collaborated with on this particular project. So this is what it looks like to the submission in the pre-selection. That got us through to round one. And round one there were 5 teams left of the 60, and we were invited to make a compact vision on the site. So I think what you see here is a very rough drawing of what the buildings could look like, but it's a lot of ingredients that we proposed. So it's about porosity, it's about an idea about energy, it's about water management, it's about a relationship to the delta, the rivers in the area. It's a suggestion about prefabricated construction. So it's mainly kind of teasing them a little bit with rich ingredients, and then on a few points diving into it and illustrating how that might materialize. So these 2 A4s then got us through to the last round with a jury report, and that's always very straightforward. They appreciated the clarity of our vision. They appreciated that we understood the local situation rather well. They appreciated the suggestion that we would incorporate a community land trust. They thought the images that we were showing were fitting to the agenda. And they were also critical of our use of architectural jargon and basically encouraging us to work on the legibility of our presentation. So it's as straightforward as that. Then there's round two, or the final round, and I'm now simply going to show you the presentation that we gave at the final presentation of this competition. So again, that starts with who we are, introducing the team, so all the advisors that we had around us, and then what do we want? What do we want from this competition? We identified three key pillars that we built the project around. The first one is to connect people, plants, and animals. The second one is to make a healthy city that would be accessible and would remain accessible. And by that, we simply mean affordable. And the last one is to eliminate as much CO2 as possible. I've occasionally in the presentation stuck these slightly ghetto translations over the presentation, but I think you'll get it. Then how do we do it? How are we going to do this? We started by looking into archive images of the site, and it's Zwolle is near the River Rhine. It's in a delta. It has a fairly rich background of agriculture and trade. It's a so-called Hansestad, and this sketch that you see from the 17th century by artist Gerard ten Borg kind of opened our eyes, how people and also architecture relates to what the environment gives us. So what you see is structures that have been built with local materials, so reeds, alders, willows, but also oak. So the fast-growing wet trees like willows, they grow near the river, and they're perfectly suitable to make facades and to make roof structures. But for example, the large hay mountain, I don't know what you call this in English, but this thing where you dry the reeds and which actually grows and shrinks with the seasons, would be made from an oak wood that would be grown in a forest nearby. But this idea of a more porous architecture and one that grows and shrinks with the seasons, that is maintained with locally grown material, we thought that was a really good starting point. And the question is, of course, how can we link this with the contemporary city without becoming all too nostalgic? So the first thing that we said, rather than making a closed perimeter block that would be very logical on the site of the designated site of the competition, we suggested to fragment it, to create many more microclimates, to create a lot more air, and to create porosity at an urban scale. By breaking the block up, we also managed to connect to the kind of secondary roots of this area. The site is a former cattle market where the farmers would come to basically trade the cattle. So it's completely vacant now, but it has a neighborhood around it where you see it here on the left with a lot of pedestrian routes through it. And the kind of small scale of those pedestrian routes, we suggested that we could basically integrate that. So we're really building on the logic of this neighborhood. The other thing that we saw is that there's a lot of in-between spaces in this neighborhood. So these kind of cold secondary structures that would be balconies, porches, this kind of in-between of public and private, we thought was a great quality. The other thing is that the old cattle market had a clear perimeter. It would always be open. You'd be able to get in and out without any problems, but there would be a clear marquee, like this sort of gate. And this really strong feeling of being inside and outside, we thought was important. So we suggested that, yes, we're making the buildings porous, but we're also stringing them together by a series of bridges so that there's a clear inside and there's a clear outside. So here you see an image coming from the surrounding neighborhood going into this area. And by doing this, by concentrating the dwellings, by linking them with these bridges, we were able to reduce the footprints of this building, thereby creating more open soil for vegetation. The program, or the actual the dwellings that make up this housing project, is a mix of co-ops, of corporation, which is, I guess, social housing in English. So it's owned by a corporation that gives it out with subsidized rent. And then there's something that we call the middle priced apartments. So this is all regulated by law, how expensive it is. And then there's 32% open market, so free market. So that's where the profit comes from in order to pay for the other things. So, and I think this mix is really important. And we convinced the municipality and also the developer to give the best place, not to the free market dwellings, but to the co-op. So that was a good thing. Along with the architectural design, we, as I mentioned, have linked a community land trust, and I'll get into that a little bit deeper later on, to this project. And in this presentation, we also project a kind of timeline of how that emerges, this community land trust. And actually, before we start construction, we start a dialogue with the local community about what the community land trust should entail, and what the concerns should be. And the neighborhood will form a kind of panel that we can also use as a kind of feedback loop for the design. Here you see the ground floor of this project, and what you see is that there's a lot of front doors. So we try to create a ground level which is as closely related to the dwellings as possible. So there's no private gardens, there's only decks. The dwellings are made fairly small and then over 2 floors. And by doing that, we basically double the amount of front doors in the ground level. So you get very active plinths. What you also see is that there is one building that is not for housing, and this is the hub building, and it has meeting spaces for the people, community kitchen, community bicycle workshop, bicycle storage, and above that, for the next decades, also car parking. The architecture is very straightforward, as in very rational grid structure. And that's for 2 reasons. On the one hand, to make the timber structure as affordable as possible. So small spans, very legible and clear, repetitive structural elements. But you also see that there's this kind of enfilade structure in the dwellings. So it goes from room to room, no corridor. And that also adds to the flexibility of the scheme. So as you see here, on the basis of that grid structure, you're able to connect or separate these grid boxes both horizontally in plan, but also in section as duplex apartments. The buildings are surrounded by balconies on both sides, so that also gives freedom in terms of, think of maybe you live on one side and you have a private balcony, and maybe you have a little business on the other side, so you could create multiple entrances to these dwellings. And that level of flexibility, we think that's key for the future proofing of our cities. So here you get an idea of that balcony, or that double facade that runs around all the buildings. Speed up a little bit. Yes, I think here you see the ground plane. The ground plane is split up into 2 layers. There's a kind of pedestrian deck that's slightly elevated above the actual ground. with the idea that the deck is obviously for people and that the ground is primarily for plants and animals. By linking these buildings up with bridges, we were able to reduce the amount of cores significantly. The blue dots are lifts, and the red arrows are stairs. And we're basically able to halve the amount of search space this way, leading to a more feasible business case, which we really need in order to build with all these bio-based materials, which are simply a bit more expensive than a traditional kind of concrete way of building. As I mentioned, the hub building is a kind of community space. It has space for working, it has space for making. There will be a guest house, and there's room for small businesses. There's also a community living room and kitchen. There's bicycle workshop. Lots of bicycle parking, so 123 homes and 400 bicycles that need to be stored. This is Holland, so the bicycle also has the best space in this mobility building at the ground floor. And above it will, over the next decades, be a structure for parking, lots of cars. But we think parking is a temporary problem. So this building has been designed so that it can become a school or an office building or more housing. So it's very generous for the ceiling heights. It already has everything's in place for installations to be integrated in the structure, and it can also be dismounted if that's necessary, because all the connections are dry. Nothing has been poured. And here you see a kind of speculation of what that plinth might look like. So the idea is that in 2026, so 2 years after we started, the community land trust will actually be found on the basis of the rule book that's been made up with the local inhabitants. And this is the key moment where the members of the community land trust give their final input for the material agenda and the architectural agenda of the project. I'm going to skip a few slides so that we can make it all in time. Obviously, there's a lot of attention for the biodiversity, so the kind of trees we use, the kind of nesting spaces that are integrated in the buildings. So bats in the roof. The buildings are all lifted so that animals such as mice, snakes, and these kind of things can all go under the buildings. So the trajectories through which they move through the area are is much larger than if the building would stand on the ground, and that really adds to the biodiversity. And you need all the insects, obviously, to attract the birds, and so we work with an ecological expert to carve out as many sort of fertile spaces for animals around the building. You also see that you have this double facade that's also for the nesting, a key space of birds. Here you're standing in the middle of this project, so you see the raised decks, you see the actual ground, which is a combination of obviously water retention and vegetation. You see that there's no private gardens, always decks. All the dwellings are oriented around this green hearth. And you see that the stairs always get priority over the lift. So we really try to encourage people to move physically with their body. This section also has an economic side to it. So the buildings have been made in the simplest form. So the thermal envelope, that's the most expensive part of the building. So the simpler we make it, the more affordable it becomes. And then the richness in the forms comes from the cold structure around it. And by separating the two, we gain a lot in the business case, through which we can then afford better materials, make floor to ceiling heights a little bit more generous, etc. I'm going to jump through all the birds. So in 2028, the community land trust is actually in charge, is given authority over the collective program and the hub space, so that mobility building. It keeps investigating what the needs are from the community, and the rule book is adjusted to that. And this is the moment when the buildings are done, that there will be a dialogue with the community about the actual design of the public space, what plants, what greenery, will there be a vegetable garden, how does maintenance work? So it's all kind of very democratic process. Jump through that quickly. This is the idea of the structure of this community land trust. So the main stakeholders are the inhabitants, but also people in the surrounding neighborhood have a real stake, and the municipality has a stake. And then the community land trust has a number of sub-associations. One is to do with circular materials. So where do the materials for the buildings come from? Where do the materials for the maintenance of the building come from? One is about mobility. One is about the hub building, so the collective spaces. And one is about permanent affordability. So to ensure that these homes are kept out of the sphere of speculation. They will not be part of the housing market, but they will remain in ownership of the cooperation. So that's the idea of permanent affordability. It doesn't apply to all the blocks, but to the darker gray ones here. So it's that's also a balance in the business case in order to get it done. It's the mobility building, it's the hub structure, and this is the circular material. Sub-association applies to all the housing blocks, and the idea is that collectively the community land trust will own a small bit of forest a couple of kilometers from the site. And the idea is that collectively, when the houses are done, we plant new trees, and in 30 years, with those trees, we can maintain the facades that are made of these timber shingles from our own trees. So that's also this idea that this new material agenda provides opportunities to create a closer connection Okay. I'm going to move ahead, conscious of time. I think this is how we set about selecting materials or a material agenda. So our site is here. It's in the middle of this delta, connected to the rivers, and those rivers, they eventually bring us to the forests in Germany and in Austria. And over the water, we can bring structural timber here in a very clean manner. Around us is first of all land that we can use, so earth, but there's also agriculture. So the three key sources of this project will be local agriculture, giving us primarily insulation materials. It's local earth, giving us mass that we need for acoustic insulation and also for thermal mass, and forestry. And that will mainly be from Germany and Austria, brought to us over the river, and that will be the key construction material. Extra attention for the sharing layers of change model of Stuart Brand. So the electricity that I was just pointing out in the image is part of this, and the idea is that you do not unnecessarily connect the different layers of a building. So you don't connect installations from structure, for example, in order to always have the maximum lifespan of those layers. The building is built on timber foundation piles that have a small concrete top to deal with the moving groundwater level. Here you see the idea of the electricity being on the walls instead of in of it. Sounds very simple, but is plays a big part in future-proofing those walls. If the electricity is ever something wrong, you don't have to open up the actual structure of the building. A clear CLT structure, relatively small spans to keep everything thin. What you see here is the floors are made of timber beams, so they're not glued-in. There's no glue in them. They're full timber, and they have small little sandwiches of rammed earth. So it's a combination, rammed earth and timber. And everything is designed in a way that it can be flat pack prefabricated. So what you see nowadays is a lot of modular construction. So you make elements that can fit on a truck, and you stack them on site, with the advantage that your building can be put into place very quickly. We actually suggested to do it in an IKEA manner. So it's flat pack, a little bit more mounting on site, a lot more freedom in design, and much more efficient transport. Key materials of the facades are shingles, timber shingles, lime, render, stucco, and timber, the actual construction inside. We do make modules of the wet cells, the bathrooms, the toilets, so they can be produced in the factory. You get much higher quality than if you do that on site for a better price. Then this idea of the secondary structures. We surprise everybody by actually rendering the construction site. So what you see here is that everything, first of all, is light. It can be transported with electric cranes rather than the traditional ones. Here you see these flat pack modules. You see these compact 3D modules. And you see, basically a clean and very silent construction site. Here you see those floors, the timber with rammed earth floors. Really fantastic innovation coming from Switzerland. Really, this is a good example, I think, of best of both worlds, using the fibers of the timber to create the spans and using the mass of the mineral rammed earth for thermal and acoustic insulation. I'll skip the energy part. Then we make a big jump to 2080, where the Community Land Trust can now decide to reprogram this mobility hub into a school or into offices, and is harvesting for the second time the trees for the new shingles. I'm going to skip through this, otherwise we won't have time for questions. So I'm gonna, I think, last bit. The idea of these flexible dwellings. I've shown the diagrams before, but with the structural engineer, we work very hard to create as much openness in the structure as possible. And what you see here is that these dwellings can be combined in plan and in section, but also in circulation. So there's many places where you can make new front doors. That can be for businesses or for a multi-generation home. But the flexibility in that structural design has been very important to us. So coming back to time, this is how we concluded our presentation in the competition. It starts by looking what came before. The first step will be to transform materials that we can harvest locally and through in a clean manner. Then there's mounting, and there's first inhabitants, and there's the kind of first wave of adaptation. And then after a couple of decades, the actual use of these structures will be very different. That's where I'd like to stop. I think we've got 15 minutes left for questions, and I very much look forward to them.
Thank you very much. That was a really brilliant talk, I think, covering a lot of issues relevant to our students and to contemporary practice more broadly. I've got a couple of questions perhaps to kick us off, and then I'm sure others, not least Sam, may want to pick up on certain themes in your talk. I suppose the kind of obvious places to start would just be to ask you to kind of reconnect explicitly what you were just presenting to sort of summarize where this dimension of how this dimension of time has been at play in your design process, and what connections you feel there are to Cedric Price's kind of mode of inquiry?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As I said in the beginning, it's always about time, and I think now with the themes of sustainability, we really have to think much critically about that. I think Cedric was way ahead of his time, embracing things like uncertainty as a kind of design strategy. And as I said, I think for me, he's been the parrot on the shoulder, kind of pushing all those things and being serious about them in a technical manner, but also in an organizational manner. So, it's not just about the building, but it's also about the social structure that goes with it. And they cannot work in isolation. They have to work together. And I think that kind of composite idea of thinking about space, to me, is something that I only was able to understand through Cedric's work. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience, which is, what, if any, would be the financial implications of raising the building off the ground to preserve the biodiversity of the site? I suppose I perhaps would take that question. I have a question that sort of comes before that, which was quite keen to hear more detail about how you approach biodiversity and this collaboration with the ecological consultant that you mentioned. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and when that comes, or start on the recording? Was that a decision by you, or was that client driven? And how do you think it changed the way you thought about design, and in what ways?
Well, I mean, there was basically no clients. This is an open competition. So, but we obviously did it as far as possible. So it's also just kind of a strategy for the competition. And sorry, the second part of your question?
The second part of, I suppose my question was really about how it future of practice in the face of potentially imminent ecological collapse and climate crisis.
Yeah, no, that's kind of the thing, right? Like we have not one crisis, we've got many, and we have to tackle them all at the same time. We can't just say we're going to just do timber architecture for the next 10 years. No, we also need to focus on social inclusivity. We also need to focus on energy. We need to focus on the biodiversity. We have to do all these different things. So we have to find ways that we're comfortable in much broader teams of expertise, and we really need to focus on understanding each other and get away from the idea that we're a kind of single author of buildings. I think it's up to us to create structures and processes through which all this knowledge and ambition and engagement can come together. I think that's I think probably my most important conclusion is that we need to develop ourselves more as editors and curators of all that input, and not just as the obligatory report from the structural engineer that we need for planning application. It all needs to become part of the design, and I think we need to manage all of that.
So just coming back to our audience question. So I know I'm getting stuck on this theme, but I think it was so rich, the project, in the way you presented it in these terms. So the question, just to repeat it, was what were the financial implications of raising the building off the ground to preserve biodiversity?
Yeah, not entirely sure. Couldn't give you an exact number. It's a little bit more expensive than laying it on the ground, but by raising it, we were also able to make the ground floor out of timber. And if we would have laid it in the ground with the wet soil in the Netherlands, that wouldn't have been wise. So it was a bit of a no-brainer. And the other advantage that we gained is that the surfacing that goes under the building remains accessible in the future. So that's another. The one critical part is accessibility, of course, for people in a wheelchair. So we have this landscape designer made this idea that the ramps could be integrated in the soil, and that was actually the most tricky part.
And what's the kind of the structure of the piling or the stilts, and how are they protected? We've got a question from the audience about how they're protected from damage by animals.
Yeah, well, we have a very wet soil in the Netherlands. We're basically on a swamp, so the groundwater level is like 20-30 centimeters under the surface. So the way this works is these timber piles, which are basically trees, they are rammed into the ground, well into the wet, into the swamp, and until they reach the sand layer, and it's typically around 15 to 20 meters deep. Then they're topped with a 2-meter high concrete pile, so that goes from the surface to 2 meters under the surface. So that will always, deal with the fluctuating groundwater level. And as long as the timber stays in the water, it will be good for hundreds of years. Yeah.
Brilliant. Amazing.